What do you have to tell me?
Sure. So the year is 1963, or maybe 1962, depending on how we want to begin. All that matters is my mom is 9 or 10 years old, and the decision has been made to leave home, to leave the country. That country being Guyana. Then, well, I guess by that point it was just known as the Republic of Guyana, but before that it was British Guyana. One of those little nations along the northeast coast of South America. I've never been. I've heard it's lovely. But my grandparents, my mother's mother and father, had gotten a bit of an indication of what was going to happen politically in the country, and they'd been living in the capital, in Georgetown. And my grandmother had been working for the sugar producers, and my grandfather had been working for like import and export company. And so they had decided he would go on first to Canada. I don't know how they decided on Canada. I think it was because, and my grandmother has told me this often, every, I guess, Christmas time and I guess periods throughout the year, there would be shipments of apples, she said, from Canada. And they would smell and taste amazing. And that makes sense, because we would have been harvesting apples in like September, October, and it would have been a rare treat to get like anything shipped that far south at that time. So I think there was just a general understanding of hearing about Canada, knowing that there could be more possibilities there, but not knowing exactly where to end up. I don't know if you've looked at Canada on a map. It's a pretty big country. So my grandfather went ahead. I think he landed in Montreal first, because at that point Montreal was like the much bigger port, the much bigger center for business. But from letters that I've found, well, we found as a family, going through some of my grandparents' old stuff, there were letters that he had sent to my grandmother from both Montreal and Toronto. So he was kind of going back and forth, making connections, the old school networking, which essentially sounded like you met someone somewhere, you gave them your business card, they gave it to someone else, and you met someone else for dinner, which isn't that weird from now, but thinking about, you know, this, at that point, I don't even know how old he was, but imagine like late 30s, man from the Caribbean, right? And kind of like darker skinned for sure. And just generally, my grandfather passed away 6 years ago. So I always think of him as very charismatic as he was, larger than life, dynamic, an entrepreneur, someone who, when you talk to them, you feel like you're talking just to them. You have their entire attention. He had a really great power for that. So it doesn't surprise me that he would have just been chatting with all sorts of people from Toronto, from Montreal, and he was writing these letters back. And at that point, my grandmother, my mother, and her younger brother had snuck out of the country, basically. Working for, and this is where you have to go into some of the economic understanding of like the Caribbean and South America. When you think about natural resources in particular, like sugarcane or cotton, any of these industries that they have a pretty sketchy history. And so the sugar producers, working for them was a really solid gig, as I understand it, because it's one of the larger industries in the space. Guyana is also known for gold, like El Dorado and all that, but I don't know, my family doesn't have too much history with that. It's more with sugar. And so she had heard, based on the close ties between that industry and the politics of the day, I think that was how the indication kind of came down, that the way the government was trying to move forward might result in some civil unrest. I haven't studied the history of Guyana too closely. Mainly, most of it's anecdotal from my family, but the way my grandmother describes it, it sounds like they were on the precipice. They were on like the cusp of something. And the 60s, a former British territory or colony, that cusp of something could have been exciting for some people, but maybe really frightening for others. And so at the time, also, one of my grandmother's older brothers was head of civil aviation, so he had access to airplanes. So when I say snuck, I mean he chartered a flight from Georgetown to Barbados. And it was kind of like dead of night sort of affair. And the way my grandmother describes it, it was very much like she had quietly handed in her notice. Her boss, though, had called to ask, what was going on, where was she going, why was she leaving? And she had to, give some sort of very vague, broad answer. And it sounds quietly like menacing and frightening because she was a secretary to someone rather high up, had access to some information. So, I mean, if I could make this into a movie, the way I see it, it's dark. You have the back of one of the smaller airports, a very long tarmac, okay, like where the plane is going to set off. And it's this tiny, tiny like Cessna. And there's my great uncle. And in his time, he was also very sharp. I've seen photos, very sharp dresser, head of civil aviation, pretty big deal. So he would just be sort of like hustling them into the plane. And remember, my mom's 10, her younger brother, my uncle, is maybe, I think 4 or 5 at that point, little kids. And their possessions, everything that they could think to take, that they could carry, would be mostly carried by my grandmother in suitcases. Think of those old school, like 60s suitcases, right? Heavy, you're not fitting a lot inside. And they were the first to go. Out of a lot of their family, actually my entire family ended up leaving to come to Canada in the decades following, but their friends too. Most of them ended up leaving, and they were the first. And when they arrived in Barbados, they were staying with family friends, the 3 of them, waiting for news from my grandfather about where to come, what to expect in terms of where they would be living, what sort of job he would have, where the kids could go to school. And then there was also the fact that based on Canada's geography, Montreal is in one of the more French-speaking parts of the country. British Guyana, English. So would they all have to learn another language in addition to this new way of life? Also, Guyana being a very warm, a very tropical country, Canadian winters are no joke, especially in Montreal, actually. So there were a lot of pros and cons. And reading my grandfather's letters at the time, because it was months that they were separated, while he was trying to figure out their life. And he was writing things like, a roast chicken costs around this much. We can expect that our rent could be around this much. Maybe, I'm looking into this. But he was kind of not only trying to build the job and the corresponding life that could exist, but kind of going out doing, in military terms, you say reconnaissance, right? Going to scope out the lay of the land, like, okay, what's going to be possible here? And reading those letters, as I've gotten to do over the past few months, it was so incredible to see the vulnerability behind the decision too. He would write, I'm not sure if this is the right choice, but I know we'll figure it out together. I'm thinking about you, I'm thinking about our children, and we'll find a way. So, 1963, they immigrated to Canada, Montreal, which was a very interesting choice. But in the business of the day, English was enough to get by with. I mean, arguably, I lived there for a little while too, and it still is, depending on where you are. But that did mean that for the first, I guess it was a year or so, they lived in a smaller neighborhood, in more of the, I would say, not most well-off part of the city. But of course, now if you go visit the Westmount area, it's pretty nice. Gentrification, of course. So they lived on Melrose Avenue in this house that my grandmother describes was caked, like the walls were black because the previous residents were smokers, like the worst kind of smokers. And at that point, she had just about convinced my grandfather to give up smoking. So it was like, all right, we need to start fresh, and this fresh start and this new world, literally, I mean, one new world country to another, if you want to think in those terms. And so they scrubbed the house from top to bottom. My mother walked to school, taking her brother with her. And this is the first time that they had done this without any kind of domestic help. And this kind of independence and learning was something that I hear in their stories often in those first couple of years. Like, what were the right winter coats to buy, right? Like, what kind of opportunities could there be for the children through school that were different than what was back home in Guyana? Also trying to get in touch with everyone, because being the first, I imagine they felt very isolated because everyone was still back home. Or at that point, technically one of my grandmother's brothers had made a family in the UK. So they weren't the only ones outside of the immediate places where they'd grown up, where they tried to raise their children. But still, I hear it in their voice, the first few years must have been really hard. Just making sense of where they were and what they were going to do next. But that decision meant that my mother and technically my uncle have spent more of their life in Canada than they did in Guyana. They are, I call them like 0.5 Canadian citizens, because they weren't naturally born on that land, but it is their country. That's where they've lived most of their lives. That's where most of their memories are. And the family did move from Montreal to Toronto in like the late 80s, early 90s. So I was born in Toronto in 1992. And my life has been there. But there's always this part that understands that that side of the family has its roots, has its origins elsewhere. And we've been talking about that a lot. Just, okay, what would it look like to go back? And my grandfather, over the course of his life, did go back several times to visit family and friends, because his parents were also there for a while. And then also for business, and then for charitable reasons as well. There was a lot of bringing the bounty back to anyone at home. So it's interesting to see that those ties continued with him, but since aren't really there anymore. And I've often asked my grandmother, I said, would you go back? Like, would you want to go back? Because she hadn't. Any of those trips that my grandfather went, she stayed at home. I mean, they traveled together all over the world as a couple, but that was one kind of trip that it sounds like she did not join him on. I asked her why. She said, it's not the same. It's not the country I remember. It's not the city I remember. And when people try and show her like photos of what Georgetown looks like today, or, oh, look at what, your old home and here's where it is now, it actually makes her really sad, because it's a totally different time and space for her. She was a different person. It was a different life. And the way things appear now, it's not as golden, not as rosy as it was in her mind, even though there were reasons that they had to leave. And I really don't think they've ever regretted the decision, at least not that they've said to me. But, that you can still tell that there's a piece of her heart that's there. And the way it is now, being so different, it hurts a little. But I gotta say, I can't regret the decision that they made to come to Canada. Pretty happy with it, being a Canadian myself, but I definitely want to go at some point. I'll have their memories with me, but I'll get to form my own. I also want to go in the jungle, just to see if I can, just to see if I can survive, with a lot of help, obviously, from people who know better than I do. But that's a part of me as well that I've never got to experience firsthand. So it'll be a bit more interesting and scary than my father's side of the family, who are from Sweden. So it's quite different. Still very cold, right, in comparison to the tropics. But yeah, I think at some point I'd like to go back in that way, right? For me and for other people, and hopefully some family members who want to go come with me, like my cousins and my sister. But I also might not wait for them. I also might just go myself. It remains to be seen. So yeah, that's my story.